In the name of one God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. After his baptism, Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan and was led by the Spirit in the wilderness. The people of God know the wilderness well. Abraham wandered the land until he rested in Canaan. Jacob slept by a stream, wrestled with an angelic entity in his dreams, and awoke with a limp and a new name, Israel. Moses and the Israelites left Egypt and traveled the wilderness for 40 years. After the Babylonian invasion, the people of God were cast into exile, a wilderness all its own. The wilderness is meant to be clarifying, renewing. When the Israelites wandered for 40 years, they had been under Egyptian rule for so long that they couldn't remember who they were anymore. As they wandered, they stripped away the things that came before: the slavery, the false gods, the desolation, and they were renewed as the people of God. God gave them nourishment when they were hungry. God gave them direction when they were lost. God instructed them on matters of faith and community when they were unsure of how to build their own society. They learned how to relate to one another and to God while traveling in the wilderness. They found out who they were and to whom they belonged. Hagar, who was the handmaiden of Sarah, who bore Ishmael before Isaac was born, went into the wilderness out of anger and jealousy. But even with ill intent to begin the journey, she too was renewed and reshaped. Her wandering led to a direct encounter with God, who gave her hope, who reminded her of her own identity and offered her assurance for her future. And she became the only woman in the entire Hebrew Bible to name God. Nobody gets to name God, but Hagar did while she was in the wilderness. She named God El Roi, God sees me. Again, a forming of relationship with God and self. The journey for Jesus in the wilderness is no different. As a response to his baptism, as a response to God's reminder that he is God's son and beloved, he is led out into the wilderness to be forged in this relational identity. 40 days he spends in one of the harshest environments I've ever experienced, with mountains and cliffs covered in sand and dirt, with little to no shade or cover to hide from the sun or the elements. And yet, it is a time of renewal and clarification. His understanding of himself and his relationship, both with God and the world, are fortified, strengthened, invigorated even. It is his assurance of his identity and relationship with God that carries him through the works of the devil, that sets the steady foundation of his resolve in the face of such desirable temptations. Jesus, like the people of God who came before him, knew the wilderness. You and I know the wilderness too. Whether literally or figuratively, we have stood on the edge of a precipice, been surrounded by rolling forests too thick to see the sun through, been subject to heat so extreme our skin blistered. We have felt the pangs of isolation, of removal. We have celebrated the gift of time away from all the hustle and bustle of life. Perhaps a sudden loss of job dropped you in the wilderness, or the unexpected news of a loved one's passing. Or perhaps you go camping with your family and get away from all the city sounds and lights. Or perhaps you have spent your summers at camp in the midst of the piney woods or the Texas hill country. Perhaps you have suffered through changes which come too fast and too hard to cope with. Perhaps you have just wandered off in search of yourself for no other reason than because you are curious. In all these ways, we are thrust into the wilderness of life, either torn and broken or hopeful and happy, to be renewed and fortified as children of God. The wilderness is a time of beauty and a time of fear, born either out of desperation or desire. It can be maddening, terrifying, rejuvenating, or purifying when we are removed from what we know, when we are faced with the reality that all we have can be stripped away, when we cannot rely on anything but God's mercy and grace for survival. We are reminded of what is left in us and for us. We are exposed for what we are, beloved children of God, dependent upon one another and God to get through this messy thing we call life. Our time wandering the wilderness brings us back to each other and back to God. It isn't the easiest way to do this, of course, but what we learn from the story of the people of God is that it's necessary. We all need our time in the wilderness to be renewed, to have our purpose and our identity clarified, to remove those things in our lives which tie us to our old ways, and to gain those things which bring us new life. And that time, friends, is now, in this season of Lent, for the next 40 days. I hope you will willingly enter the wilderness. I hope you will journey with us in the church across the desert or the forest or the canyons, and let the wilderness of life strip away from you whatever has been taking the place of your relationship with God. We give things up or we take things on during Lent for this very reason, so that we might be renewed in our identities, so that we might meet God again, know God again, find God in each other again. The people of God have been going into the wilderness for millennia. Lent is our yearly season to join them, to do our own wandering, and to hopefully be renewed. So I invite you to a holy Lent, a time of prayer and fasting, a time of wandering in the wilderness, so that we might find God and each other again. Amen.